webinar. Before we start, let me highlight few housekeeping items. So during the webinar, please feel free to post questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end. Recording of this session will be shared to you in next 24 to 48 hours. So today's topic for the session is best practices to drive user adoption for SharePoint and Office 365. So before we start, let me take this opportunity to introduce you to today's presenter, as well as my colleague, Mr. Akil Haider, who is the VP for Technology Solutions at Winwire. Akil brings over 15 years of IT industry experience and specializes in application development using SharePoint, .NET Framework, and other various Microsoft platforms. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Akil. Akil, over to you.
Thank you, Noor. Appreciate it. Hello, guys. Welcome to our session on driving user adoption for SharePoint and Office 365. And as Noor introduced myself, before we get into it, a brief introduction about who I am. I am currently based out of, I work as a VP of Technical Solutions for Winwire Technologies, and we are based and headquartered out of our Santa Clara office here in California. If my contact information is on the screen and will be shared as Noor said as part of the recording, and you can contact him at marketing@winwire.com. My focus has been heavily in SharePoint for the last 12 to 13 years, with a overall emphasis on an end-to-end deployment of SharePoint technologies. As a senior architect, I have overseen and provided direct contribution in many SharePoint deployments, and therefore today's topic of discussion around driving user adoption fits very well into the overall grand scheme of my expertise. And today's topics that we will be covering is that we have all seen very good and very bad SharePoint deployments during our life cycle in the industry. And what we've brought together is lessons learned from that, have put together our point of view and thought leadership on what we believe is the right way to deploy SharePoint and quote unquote around the right. And to motivate and encourage our users how to best use SharePoint to perform their jobs better, to perform their business activities better. It also feeds directly then into what relevant business solutions can SharePoint be used for, and make sure that those are met vis-a-vis the business needs that need to be aligned and satisfied for that. And also identify some basic training and change management needs that an organization needs to go through when they are deploying SharePoint. We'll briefly talk about implementing a game plan and some gamification techniques as a learning strategy to deploy SharePoint. And what an IT organization can do to mentor and support users and super users to help promote the benefits of SharePoint. And lastly, at the very end, we will discuss how to create a phased rollout approach for the adoption program that enables change, empowers your end users versus taxing them, and facilitates knowledge sharing within the organization. And as I will briefly, before I get into the discussion points, feel free at any moment to document questions relevant to each section, and we will give ourselves roughly about 10 minutes towards the end of the discussion to cover any of those questions. So quickly moving into current user adoption issues that we have seen in many of our deployments. One size doesn't fit all. This is a common misconception in the marketplace that SharePoint has a singular level of training or a singular type of adoption plan that can be defined for every single organization. And many a time when we go into an organization, the same generic training, the same generic classes, the same type of rollout plans have been deployed for all workloads and all different use cases of SharePoint. And the point is that it does not fit at all, because organizations are different in their culture, they're different in their workforce dynamic, they are different for various different reasons that SharePoint is being deployed within their organization. So it's very important to understand that you need to define adaptive new SharePoint adoption plans for each organization and each particular use case, and we'll get more into it as we go throughout our discussion. But the point at the overall message of this concept here is that one size does not fit all, and you should be aware of that. The next point, as I was elucidating to it earlier in my conversation, is that SharePoint training doesn't seem to be working. We've gone into many of our clients where they're like, we've bought canned training from different resources, different companies out there. We've sent our developers to this training. We've sent our end users to these different types of training. And it doesn't seem to be working, and what's the reason behind it? Well, there are what we have assessed and brought together is that there are many times where such training is non-contextual to the reason or the use cases for which SharePoint has been deployed in the enterprise. Secondly, the roles and responsibilities of what my role is within an organization is unclear to me during this training. Am I a site owner? Am I a site contributor? Am I a reader? And what is my specific training for all of these different types of roles varies, and it doesn't seem to be addressed when people go to just generic level SharePoint training. Thirdly, there is a technology gap between the level of technology that SharePoint has evolved to over the years and is delivering a particular service within an organization versus the user base that is consuming that technology. Sadly, that is a reality, and it's not a bad thing. It can easily be addressed. But if you're aware of it, you can make a plan that will accordingly adjust for that. It's important to know that there is a technology gap between the audience that is consuming SharePoint as a service and they're used to doing certain things a certain way versus what the technology platform can bring. And lastly on this slide, but most importantly, is how can SharePoint make my job better? This is a central question that must be addressed, and as I go through this entire deck, you will see an emphasis on this point repeatedly. But the point here is that the user audience is not bought into the whole concept of SharePoint as a technology solving their business problem. And that, in essence, until and unless you believe in it, you don't follow it. So regardless of whether you can train people, if they still don't adopt that training because they don't believe that SharePoint can make their job better, it's not going to stick. So the overall concept is that you have to enlighten people to that it actually does make their job better. So some statistics, and this is a big challenge with big enterprises and big institutions where we have gone into, and that there are the reason SharePoint adoption is low is that collaboration itself is a challenge. Teams today are overwhelmed with the amount of content flowing into their inbox, into the multiple SharePoint sites that they might be prescribing to. Every single group, every single individual within an organization sometimes has a SharePoint site. And so 61% of time is spent coordinating collaboration. This is a huge statistic which is a very scary thing for people like me in enterprise content management, where we are here to solve exactly this problem, that users spend such a high amount of time just in actual coordination activities versus producing deliverables that they could be using elsewhere. So it's important to address this big concern. And the second statistic, which is really on the decline, but it's still a problem within the industry, is that a lot of time is spent in duplicating work and searching for information. 38% of productivity within organizations is lost, and if you compute the man hours that translates into over the years, it's almost 800 people-person man hours per year per individual at 40%. And that is a huge loss in productivity to organizations. So it is in the best interest of organizations to address all of these concerns if they want to increase their overall productivity to improve their facilitation for collaboration. And lastly, but most importantly in this section, the non-technical challenges that we run into organization are always harder to overcome. There is an issue with culture where people are, as I mentioned, used to doing certain things certain ways. Because people lack an understanding of how SharePoint works, there is a concern around privacy. People feel more that if they publish a document into SharePoint, everybody and anybody can get to it if they don't understand how those permissions are managed, for example. A lot of times it has to do with control. If I put a document out there, then I lose control over it. That's a fear that end users have. And as I mentioned earlier, users sometimes lack motivation because they are used to doing certain things a certain way. And because the organization has not educated its users, the purpose for which SharePoint is deployed within an enterprise is not really clear to end users. All of these combine together to culminate in a change management issue and a change management problem that is very difficult for end users to overcome. And so just before we get into how to solve all of these things, it's important to qualify and quantify within your organization some important aspects on how SharePoint is currently deployed. And what is the current process and how people are going to get trained within an organization. If you haven't defined that, then you've already failed ahead of doing your rollout. Not that it's not a recoverable situation, but it's certainly a problem that exists and you should consider for it. And if you, being you as in the IT organization, if you know that you have defined a SharePoint training plan, have you actually created measurable success factors that can be measured, that the training that you are delivering is indeed effective? And we'll show you some examples of how we've qualified and quantified this at our different clients as we go through. And lastly, but most importantly, is there a formalized qualification process that needs to be defined within your organization that, hey, this person is capable and has the necessary technical and business skills to run a SharePoint site? I know I've asked this question and I give an equation, an analogy over here, which is like, If you are managing your company's public-facing internet site, I'm sure not every person has access to write to that site. And similarly, I'm sure that the people who are managing that site for your organization are very well trained in that technology to manage its capabilities. Similarly, it's important for SharePoint adoption to be considered and to go higher up within an organization, that there is some formalized qualification process to be certified to run SharePoint sites. Whether that is some certification from Microsoft or something, or a customized training that is developed specifically for your deployment, that can be considered as part of the overall gamification plan, and I'll get into that as we go into that section. So, Winwire's solution to this entire big problem. We've come to understand, as I've driven through the last 5-6 slides, that there are significant adoption challenges within most organizations. And our goal is a three-pronged approach. First is that you must have some sort of a excitement-driven drive within an organization, that it's really cool to be a SharePoint guru or somebody who can drive this change. Secondly, an IT organization or the people who are deploying, whether it's us as vendors or local people within the organization deploying SharePoint, must facilitate that change within an organization. And lastly, but most importantly, it's important that we empower our users, but also assist them in that process as they go through the transformational change within their organization as SharePoint is deployed. And so let's take a step back and define what are the sustainable adoption objectives that must be achieved for successful adoption. You want to minimize the impact of making technology changes. You definitely want to promote the adoption of new systems and solutions within your organization. And you must provide those users with the resources that they need to be successful. I've already highlighted in my previous slide the need for the importance of this third bullet point cannot be highlighted enough. And lastly, encourage an organization culture which embraces ongoing evolution. It's like any other thing, and I give this analogy in my other presentations as well, that 50 years ago, memos used to be sent out, and it used to take a long time for communication at the corporate level. Today, we have moved that to an email situation. And the next evolution of that is the organizational cultural change that will come as we embrace an ongoing evolution towards SharePoint and web-based technologies. So now we've highlighted at this point all the issues. We have come up, we've defined what our objectives should be when we are deploying a successful SharePoint adoption plan. And in detail, I'm going to cover each step of what it takes to actually get there. And this will map to our overall topics that we were supposed to cover for today's discussion. So the 5 steps that we have defined or we have seen in our deployments as the most successful steps to drive sustainable adoption has to do with making sure that each of these items is addressed in any SharePoint deployment. The first step is to make sure that stakeholder buy-in is secure. Second is to map to business value. Third, facilitate purposeful collaboration. Fourth is to drive that success through that engagement model that we just talked about. And lastly, but most importantly, to evaluate, adapt, and iterate over what we learn throughout our deployment. And I will now, for the next 30 minutes or so, expand expand on each of these individual items as we get into our discussion. So the first thing that any SharePoint deployment must have in order for it to be successful is to ensure that stakeholder buy-in is secured. And what do I mean by that? Well, I have has your SharePoint vision been defined? Have you actually sat down with your leadership and the C-level management team, and do they understand and agree with the value the technology brings to the organization? It is important that you build a business case with that leadership, and they are educated on SharePoint as a platform. This is the responsibility of the IT organization as much as any other vendor or the person who is owning SharePoint or wanting to deploy SharePoint within an organization. I skipped the first statistic because it is on your screen, but I want to make sure that it is narrated here for the audience, and it's important because when I read this, it scared me as an individual, because I found out that 80% of all social business efforts will not achieve the intended benefits due to inadequate leadership and overemphasis on technology. It is not a technology issue that SharePoint fails at 99% in my opinion as a deployment. It is exactly 80% of the times it fails because there is not enough involvement of the leadership at the upfront level. And it's also because the C-level management team has not been brought on board. The quantification and qualification of the financial gains, the customer satisfaction improvements, and all the great things that SharePoint can do to reduce the time to market of deliverables into real dollars has not been translated to the C-level team, and they have not bought into that whole idea. That is one of the biggest reasons why SharePoint as an adoption plan fails. So it's very important to create a vision statement which has your high-level goals and priorities set, and it enables your leadership to foresee how SharePoint will evolve to bring the organization and the entire culture within the organization to the next level, and will help them get to that added value that translates into real dollars. It's important to make sure you guide them to help identify all of these measures of success, and that you actually produce some deliverables which can see those. And when I go into the last section of today's discussion, I will talk specifically about dashboards that can help measure the ROI in such a scenario. When you are deploying a SharePoint deployment, this is just for the education of the audience, as I've already covered why it's important to get stakeholder buy-in. But what type of people need to be involved is the next question that I'm asked. And most of the times, it's just people at the exec level getting involved. Absolutely not. It is important that executives plus departmental / divisions, however the company org structure is structured, are all aligned within the vision statement that is defined for the company. And the goals and objectives are clearly documented and agreed upon. Setting up a steering committee, setting up a regular checkpoint with them to ensure that everybody is all on the same page makes the project greatly more possible for success than it would otherwise. It's important to involve different project managers that are involved for carrying out the plan that supports this overarching vision. A lot of times we have seen that deployments like these take place at client locations where there is no specific assigned project manager for managing the SharePoint user adoption plan. And that can have significantly negative impacts. I will not get into the SDLC discussion of why that is the case, but it's important that there is a single point of ownership to drive the execution of the plan that the leadership agrees upon. Lastly, but most importantly, is the IT lead. Whoever, in this case I put it down as IT lead, but it could be anyone, whoever is the person in charge of setting the vision in the context of other initiatives taking place in the IT landscape. So prioritization of SharePoint as a service, prioritization of SharePoint's use cases for which it is being deployed is extremely important when you are securing stakeholder buy-in, so that not only are all the executive and departmental owners bought in, but it is also a priority in the IT landscape of things. And just another quick example before we move on to our next discussion point is for the audience here today, is why are we deploying SharePoint at this time? It's just to ask and document the responses to these questions. And this will help you qualify and quantify the ROI of SharePoint and measure against the success factors, as I mentioned, that you deploy SharePoint for within your organization. How does SharePoint support our overall mission, value, strategies? If you're not answered this question, then you need to take a step back and define that. Then how will SharePoint change the way we are working? Are we currently working on paper? Are we currently working in Excel spreadsheets? Are we currently working in email? And if we deploy SharePoint as a document management or an enterprise content management system, how will that change? It's important to document the how. It's also very important, as I mentioned, to know how will we know if it is successful, and how are we going to measure that. Lastly, as I mentioned, what will and how will SharePoint benefit the overall company? Is it just a tool that's being deployed because it's out there, or is it actually going to reap some positive benefits for the overall company? Let's document the responses to these questions in an Excel sheet and make sure that it is evangelized within an organization. Lastly, will every employee benefit from SharePoint? And if not, then how can that value or proposition be driven so that that SharePoint benefit can be realized by every employee? Because if it's not, then the motivation factors that I talked about earlier, where users don't change, will come into play. Moving into our second point, which was, as I brought up earlier, is mapping the value of deploying SharePoint to a business value or a business problem that we're trying to address. Just some quick statistics at the very early part of our discussion is that 53% of workforce productivity decreases with change when not properly managed. So this is a big thing. Every time we've deployed 80+ SharePoint deployments in my career over the last 10 years or so, you run into, we deployed SharePoint, we loved it as a tool, but somehow our overall productivity, instead of it increasing, has decreased. What is the reason for it, Akil? And it comes into some discussion points is have you actually identified the opportunities to use SharePoint as a service that map to that vision that we talked about earlier, and have you actually, does that actually naturally fit within the product's capabilities? A lot of times we end up walking into an organization where SharePoint has been deployed as a solution for technologies that it was never intended to be. And I'll get into that discussion as well. And secondly, people have never surveyed the company population to prioritize the list of use cases that should be deployed, that, hey, if we're going to deploy SharePoint, what's going to be the maximum impact? How can I have the most impact with the least investment that will impact 80% of the user base? I know one particular example here where an individual wanted to deploy SharePoint just for their particular need. It was one person within a 1,500 people organization. The point is that had a very low impact versus deploying SharePoint for where 1,500 people would be using it within an organization. And again, we at WinWire have leveraged SharePoint as a new way to work for a platform and have an entire discussion and a panel and a webinar on that. But SharePoint as a product can be used for an intranet, it can be used for project management. I've just thrown out some examples over here, like an HR onboarding system, as a corporate communications portal. It spans a bunch of technologies from Windows desktops to mobile devices, and it integrates and touches Office at every level. It touches back office systems at every level. So it's very important to map that business value on how we are going to work together as a company. And the future of work, as quote unquote WinWire's point of view on this, and our point of view and my point of view, is that any SharePoint deployment must solve these three central problems. It must allow users to collaborate, it must allow users to connect, and effectively communicate. And therefore, it's important to ensure that this is mapped directly to that business, the problem of business value that we are trying to solve for SharePoint. Moving into our third discussion point, that SharePoint must facilitate purposeful collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, that 61% of time is lost between end users because they are spending time are not spending time doing actual collaboration, but they are lost in the myriad of trying to facilitate purposeful collaboration. What do I mean by facilitating purposeful collaboration? What I mean to say is develop use cases, specific use cases for which SharePoint will be deployed within your organization. It's important to understand and make sure that you will put those initiatives into practice in a prioritized manner. Don't try to boil the ocean when you try to deploy SharePoint, that it's going to be all and all of every single technology and business problem within your organization. Start with a defined set of 3 to 5 use cases so that you can focus your IT resources, business resources, and vendor resources to successfully deploy those. And a lot of times this happens at our deployments where SharePoint is deployed as a very tightly controlled combination of top-down strategic use, but it doesn't translate well in adoption. It's always good to have some viral growth happening by releasing SharePoint in an unmanaged situation as well. And I'm not trying to say don't deploy it using managed governance. I'm trying to say that it's always good to allow users to be able to play with it, quote unquote, so that they can learn about the technology and get excited about it. It's also very important to make sure that resources are identified for every use case. What is the challenge and opportunity that you're trying to solve? What are the business benefits you want to achieve out of this? What behaviors will need to be changed to realize these outcomes? And it's important to document that question because in 90% of the cases, a lot of times changes with it, what needs to change within an organization is never qualified. Who is the champion owner and community manager of this within your organization? Who is going to actually drive this within different groups, different divisions, people who've been using it? There'll always be 3 classes of people in my opinion. One are early adopters who love everything. Then there'll be a general population that will come along with you as the momentum builds within an organization. And there will be, of course, those people slacking behind because they just don't adapt to change. And what is the project timeline and review date? It's important to document all of those as well. It's important that what materials and resources are available to help are also very clearly articulated to the end users. So if they have questions about certain things, they don't necessarily always have to open a help desk ticket. They can actually have a location to go to get that information. And as the bullet point in blue mentions at the very end, which says for each use case, it's important then to develop contextual and targeted training. As I mentioned earlier, non-contextual training is a big problem when it is just generic. It's important that contextual training focused towards a particular audience, focused towards a particular use case, is developed for every SharePoint deployment. A lot of times this is not done within organizations, and this is one of the big reasons why purposeful collaboration fails. I skipped the point on how to measure success because I'm going to discuss that in a later slide. The fourth but most important is that you as an IT organization or the champions of SharePoint within an organization drive that success. I've covered the first three, and now what do I mean by drive success? It's important that anytime SharePoint is deployed in an organization, that IT capacity is there to manage that change. There should be an active business engagement capability within the IT organization to engage with business to ensure that for the use cases for which SharePoint is being deployed, that the business understands all the capabilities that that need to be supported. That there is an adequate support and maintenance plan around SharePoint for the workloads for which it is being deployed. If there are specific use cases such as an intranet or a communications portal, and end users have questions around it, but the IT capacity is not there to support it, that will cause a huge issue within the organization. Lastly, but most importantly, it's always good to develop a center of excellence within an IT organization, which provides trainings, which provides FAQs, and provides detailed, comprehensive support to the business for driving success within that organization. And how will we build this out? Well, you can, and of course, you need to build a training within your IT organization, which includes system admin level training, developer level training, site owner level training, content owner, content publisher, content reader. There are at least 6 to 7 different types of training materials that need to be developed. Enhancement, if you don't already have a governance plan, always plan on deploying one, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into the next couple of minutes. And then lastly, but most importantly, to ensure that industry and best practices and tools are deployed within your organization to enhance IT's capability to measure the success of SharePoint deployment, as well as SharePoint to be consumed within your organization. As I mentioned, driving success, a lot of times it has to depend with ensuring that a governance plan is either developed or enhanced if there one already exists for content management within an organization. Many customers come to us when they have deployed SharePoint and they say, well, we don't understand why SharePoint is not successful. We didn't believe in governance, and this is why. Governance has to be relevant. It has to be operational to that particular use case and organizational deployment that you're performing. Too little control results in a free-for-all, and we've seen this many a time where the platform has had SharePoint site sprawl with content sprawl, and you have tons of duplicated content and you don't know what is what. Too much control results in a situation where people can't use the platform because IT has locked down so many things. I can't even upload a file worth more than 10 MB into this thing, and everybody is more frustrated trying to use the platform, for example. So it's important that finding that middle ground is there. It's important that there are tools that are deployed that can measure the governance plan, and that it integrates overall with the business and IT governance. This webinar there is an entire webinar in our series which is focused just on SharePoint governance, but at the very end I will just say that governance is an evolving, living, breathing process that changes as an IT organization matures through its life cycle. And it's important to put that into place whenever you are deploying SharePoint as a solution. And this is a slide that I have adopted from Microsoft, and many on occasion have mentioned it, that for different use cases, for example, as I mentioned, SharePoint as a portal, or SharePoint integrated with Yammer for a community site, for social collaboration, for project and team sites, the governance needs to adopt as well. It's very tightly controlled. At the very top level, it becomes looser as I get down to my own granular level. This is the gamification plan that I had mentioned earlier. It is important that whenever SharePoint is deployed, that some sort of game plan or some sort of project plan is put into place for its release and for its management, long-term sustenance, and so forth within an organization. A timeline must be created to measure it. A conceptualized launch event must be created. What I mean by that is that instead of just sending out an email saying SharePoint will be available as a service, it must actually be more than that. It must involve people being brought into like a brown bag, being brought into a room, announcements going out, things like that that develop an interest and drive that message home. Developing the communications as well is very important, so that multiple facets and multiple channels of communication are developed, not just email, spam, and so forth. Training preparations, as I've already mentioned so many times, must take place. Some sort of management of the information that you release within your different communities needs to be there. And lastly, but most importantly, the technical needs that need to be deployed within your organization need to be identified ahead of time so that you can appropriately adjust, hire, bring in vendors to perform the adoption of SharePoint within an organization. So specifics, breaking that down, what I just communicated into specifics. Let's make sure that a specific date or period of time to launch is identified so that ample time is there to prepare, build, and ensure that the overall launch is celebrated. Developing proper communications and training before and after the launch is extremely important. Engagement to increase an initial participation in your network. All of these things, as I just mentioned, like brown bag lunches, inviting people to corporate events, setting up a regular checkpoint within each business unit on how things are going, having IT go to them versus them coming to you is very important. And lastly, as I said, it's important that, it will take some time. People have been using email for 20 years. You cannot just expect that to be suddenly changed by deploying SharePoint. So it will take time to gain some momentum, and it will become self-sustainable. I give the analogy that, hey, once somebody figured out how cool Facebook was, suddenly it became usable everywhere else. But for the first 10, 15 years, it had not reached that point of inflection with the total number of users that were on it. And account for this within your timeline and transition period. quick overview of what I meant by what you can do to drive some success are listed here. I don't have the time to cover everything, but the best point most of this stuff I've already covered. It's important to make sure that training is relevant, as I mentioned, in each use case and audience, that tasks are assigned to people after the training and that IT actually tracks that and then awards that as well with recognition and so forth. And then a monitoring and support rollout plan is there to ensure that compliance is met with the overall governance structure that we had discussed earlier as is defined. The last step, and I'll quickly cover this and open it up for questions, which is once a SharePoint deployment has taken place, you've taken all these steps, it cannot ever be within any organization be considered successful unless you are able to evaluate your deployment, and based on the feedback that you get, you are able to adapt and iterate over it. So what do I mean by that? As I mentioned, creating a long-term success plan where achievements are reviewed, momentum can be sustained, and adapting to new things as people are discovering things about SharePoint, they'll come with you with, hey, can SharePoint do this? And you must have a plan to address all of those types of questions. Evaluate what you've already accomplished. A lot of times SharePoint gets deployed and for 6 months people don't even look at what was deployed. It's important to do that. Showcase the successes throughout your organization. If a SharePoint was deployed, for example, to solve a workflow problem that took 30 days to get something to the market for your organization and now takes 3 hours to get all the approvals, you might want to showcase that as a case study within your organization. You don't need us as vendors to come in and do that, but you can drive that within your community. And take the best practices from previous achievements and apply them to next steps. I've said this many a time that if you take a phased rollout approach, you learn something from your first deployment. Take that feedback, document that feedback, don't ignore it, and then act on it so that you can apply those lessons learned to the next. As I've mentioned, the ultimate goal has always been to figure out that, hey, we don't want to be in the business of managing this. We want to enable individuals throughout the organization for continued growth of the platform. And as individuals use the platform more and more, the momentum will increase overall within an organization. And I give the Facebook example over here again, that until that point of inflection is reached, SharePoint as a platform will not be adopted, but it will continue to grow. Your job is to drive it to that particular point. And as I mentioned, it's always good to ensure that you can measure usage and ongoing scalable support. Use tools such as policy templates which come natively within SharePoint to provide guidelines on how to use enterprise social responsibly. It's also there that you should build third-party tools and internal SharePoint logs to develop reports through your help desk system to troubleshoot the enterprise issues that your SharePoint deployment sees and social issues that your SharePoint deployment has, but also to be able to report back on it. Gather feedback. A lot of times SharePoint deployments happen where people don't deploy service, don't ask end users, hey, what do you think about that? Encourage that with some sort of a prize and award and recognition if you have to, and you will always be able to get and adapt your technology as it evolves through its life cycle. And we'll show you some examples of how a success criteria dashboard can be created to track progress on the overall rollout and adoption. This is the point I was trying to make, that success must always be measured. It must be measured in terms of ROI. You can use social engagement data to support your findings as an IT organization. What was the business value opportunity? How did it help? How did SharePoint help with it? What was achieved and how is it measured? All of these need to come together. So as you can see on your screen, there is an example of this, that collaboration allowed people, instead of emailing huge files across regions, they were able to upload and use SharePoint as a collaboration portal. It increased the global spread of the business. It allowed people to do that. And there was a 15% improvement in the overall number of successful innovations for new products or services. This is a tactical level example from how we measured success when we did a deployment. Examples of how your network has grown, how many members are getting engaged with you. These are data points that must be documented by an IT organization and shared with the leadership, as I mentioned, to validate that initial vision plan that can show an ROI to the overall business case and success case. Lastly, for example, another use case was an employee engagement portal, and when we deployed that, it resulted in finding experts and information faster. Time was saved. People were able to get to the person that they wanted to ask a question by making sure that data was relevantly present in SharePoint versus having to spam an email to a distribution list asking a question. And therefore, there was a 30% increase in experts and knowledge base. All of these can be measured by deploying the tools that come with SharePoint. Lastly, and I will conclude on this and open it up for questions. What we don't call SharePoint just a SharePoint deployment, we call it a SharePoint journey. And as I mentioned, when you are creating a SharePoint adoption plan along with that journey, these are the steps that I have covered today that you need to do, or you need to ensure that adoption is successful within your organization. There must be a contextual training that must be developed within your organization. A lot of activities take place ahead of time. You get the executive buy-in and commitment. You define the SharePoint governance plan. You then create the business value proposition and business solutions. You implement the governance plan, and you build the knowledge and co-creation as you roll out your SharePoint solution. Overall, and then you iterate over this entire process and open it for your end users to be able to give you feedback that you can absorb and improve your overall SharePoint deployment. So at a very high level, that is what we believe SharePoint, defining a SharePoint user adoption plan must map to a SharePoint user adoption roadmap, and this is how it comes together. Quickly, I will cover who we are. I know there are some people on the call that might not even know who we are. We are an IT solutions management consulting company, and we are a Microsoft Gold partner headquartered managed Microsoft Gold partner headquartered in Santa Clara, California. You've seen some of our solutions earlier, and overall we have a heavy presence in the collaborative and analytics solution space. We also offer mobility and cloud solutions, and we have a heavy practice focused on both of those technologies. At this point, Noor, I would like to open this session up with 5 minutes remaining to any Q&A questions that you might have actually got for me at this point.
Thanks, Akhil. Thanks for sharing some of the best practices to enhance user adoption of SharePoint. Yes, I do have a few questions coming from the audience. So first, let me pick up the first question coming from John. He asked, what can an executive do to support for SharePoint initiatives?
Very good question. I think an executive must be involved, first of all. It's very important, as I mentioned earlier, that setting up something like a steering committee, ensuring that there is buy-in from the executive leadership, building and bringing those peers into his exec leadership who are peers of his into, or his or her, in this case, into that discussion is very important. So evangelizing the solution, building a consensus within an organization and driving a steering committee discussions are examples of what an executive can do in order to facilitate SharePoint adoption. It's important to get someone to sponsor SharePoint as a solution, and if there is an exec within an organization interested in doing that, he or she must allocate sufficient time within their day job to be able to do that.
Thank you, thank you. So the other question coming from Larry, who asked, like, what are some of other ways to measure SharePoint portal adoption? Like, you did speak about some of the measuring success, but can you highlight some of the other stats or other areas that would help us measure SharePoint portal adoption?
Absolutely. So I'll focus on some technical ones and some non-technical ones. So the first one is very simple. It has to do with the fact that within an organization, if SharePoint is being used, if links are being sent, if people are loving the portal, if there is a general positive vibe within an organization, people go to the portal to get their information, for example. There is a reduction in traffic, email traffic overall. You will see that improvement. Number two, you can measure success by actually building those dashboards that I talked about. You can actually pull the logs, have your IT information, create a dashboard for you where you can measure how many attachments were going through within your system before SharePoint was deployed, for example, versus what it is today, versus what it was 3 months ago, and so forth, just to give a very tactical example. But I think dashboarding of how the overall IT infrastructure usage is there is one example. The third but most important one is word of mouth. Is like, hey, I'm loving this solution, or hey, I hate it, you know. Those are the kind of things you have to listen to and hear. And a lot of times we in the IT organization, when we hear the word, oh, I don't like SharePoint, we get defensive. The idea is, no, hear them out. Listen to why they don't like SharePoint, and then maybe come up with an action plan to address those. So those are some of the examples, as I mentioned, on how we can ensure that overall SharePoint can be measured. And all of this must translate and map to the ROI that SharePoint was, when SharePoint was deployed, on the cost of deploying SharePoint within an organization. If the SharePoint deployment, whatever the dollar amount might have cost an organization, can have a 10x impact on the amount of storage, for example, that an organization uses on its Exchange side, is a great example for measuring success of SharePoint. If people are now using a SharePoint workflow to ensure that certain deliverables are met, that is a huge success factor. So it's how your users are using it, and then creating this informational dashboard to see how this ROI is not only highlighted within an organization, but overall as well. I know we're coming up on the hour. Are there any other questions, Noor, at this point?
Yeah, just in the interest of time, probably I'll take one last quick question for the day. So what are specific training that people need to focus for SharePoint adoption?
That's a rhetorical question in itself. As I mentioned, SharePoint, the entire purpose of today's deck was that there is no specific training. Training needs to be adaptive to the organization and use case. So we can definitely help you with creating a SharePoint training plan that is specific for your deployment when we are doing that deployment for you. Or even if you've already done your deployment and you need our help to create that SharePoint training plan, we can help you with that as well. But there is no, the entire message of this discussion was that generic training, in our opinion, fails, and it does not deliver or drive that SharePoint adoption as we have just talked about.
Okay. Thanks, Akhil. Thanks for the wonderful session. I hope the audience here would have enjoyed the same. So thanks everyone for taking time and joining today for us for this wonderful session. Have a good day. Thank you, Akhil.
Thank you, Noor. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.